The SOS lasted 40 seconds. 40 seconds of raw, compressed emergency data screaming across 4 star systems on every frequency simultaneously. The kind of broadcast you only sent when you had stopped worrying about who might hear it and started worrying about whether anyone would hear it in time. The signal carried coordinates, a species identifier, a threat assessment, and a casualty count that was already climbing when the transmission was made and had almost certainly climbed further since. It reached the UES Thermopylae at 2:11 hours on a Wednesday, and Admiral James Kowalski was asleep when it arrived and awake 30 seconds later when his communications officer, Lieutenant Priya Voss, hit the emergency alert that brought every senior officer on the ship from sleep to their stations in under 4 minutes. Kowalski was on the bridge in 3. He was 61 years old. He had commanded ships for 32 of those years, everything from patrol frigates to the Thermopylae itself, which was the largest warship humanity had ever built, a Dominion-class Dreadnought that stretched 1,100 meters from bow to stern and carried a crew of 4,200 and a weapons complement that the fleet's own documentation described, in the particular dry language of military specifications, as strategically significant, which meant it could crack a moon if the situation called for it, and nobody wanted to say that in official paperwork. He stood at the command display and read the SOS data and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "Voss source." She said, "The Irathi Collective, Admiral, populated world designated Irath Secundus, approximately 19 light hours from our current position. The signal is coming from their orbital defense network, or what's left of it." He said, "What's left of it?" She said, "The signal carries partial sensor data. Based on that data, approximately 60% of the Irathi orbital network has been destroyed. The attacking forces." She hesitated for the fraction of a second that told Kowalski she was looking at something she hadn't expected. She said, "The attacking force is Crawl, Admiral, main battle fleet. We're looking at their first Dominion fleet." The bridge went quiet. The Crawl First Dominion Fleet was not a phrase that prompted quietness in most military contexts. It prompted specific, detailed, historically grounded fear in people who understood what it meant. The Crawl were the largest military power in the sector, possibly in the known galaxy, with a fleet that had been built over 600 years of continuous expansion, and that had not, in that entire time, lost a major engagement. The First Dominion Fleet was their premier force, their heaviest ships, their best commanders, deployed only for targets that required the absolute maximum the Crawl could bring to bear. Whatever the Irathi had done, or whatever they had that the Crawl wanted, it had earned them the First Dominion Fleet. The Irathi Collective was not a military power. They were a trading civilization, 3 worlds, population of approximately 9 billion across their system, with a defense network that was respectable for a species that had never expected to fight a major war and completely inadequate for the force currently dismantling it. Kowalski looked at the tactical display that Voss was building from the SOS data, the partial sensor picture of what was happening 19 light hours away right now, the fires in orbit and the fleet that was causing them. He said, "How many ships in the Crawl First Dominion Fleet?" His tactical officer, Commander Seth Akafer, said, "Based on compact intelligence assessments, the First Dominion Fleet fields between 200 and 230 vessels at full strength. The SOS data shows approximately 180 contact signatures, which is consistent with a primary strike force leaving reserve elements at their staging point." He said, "And the Irathi defense network went intact." Akafer said, 43 orbital platforms, 12 system defense vessels, no capital ships. They built for piracy suppression, not fleet engagement." Kowalski said, "They're not going to last." Akafer said, "No, Admiral, they're not." "A beat." Kowalski said, "What do we have in the Thermopylae group?" Akafer straightened slightly at his station, the subtle physical shift of a man who had just registered the direction this conversation was taking. He said, "The Thermopylae, escorts Vandal, Crusader, and Nightfall, support vessel Meridian Ridge, combat logistics ship Helena, total combat strength 4 vessels." Kowalski said, "Against 180 crawl warships." HFY said, "Yes, Admiral." Kowalski looked at the display for 10 more seconds. The casualty count in the SOS data sat in the corner of the screen, 9 figures that represented Irathi dead, and that had stopped updating when the transmission cut off, but that everyone on the bridge understood was not a final number by any measure that mattered. He said, "Get me fleet command on a priority channel, and plot a course to Irath Secundus, best possible speed." His navigation officer, Lieutenant Commander Anators, said, "Admiral, at maximum FTL, the Thermopylae group makes transit in approximately 17 hours. He said, "Then we start now. Tors, get us moving. Voss, Fleet Command. HFY, I want a full tactical assessment of the Crawl First Dominion Fleet on my console in 1 hour. Everything we have. Ship classes, weapons systems, formation doctrine, known command tendencies. Everything." HFY said, "Aye, Admiral." Kowalski said, "And someone wake up Captain Reyes. Tell her the Thermopylae is going to combat speed, and she should know why before she asks." He walked to his command chair and sat down, and looked at the course plot Tors was building on the main display. The line from here to Irath Secundus across 19 light towers of space, and he thought about 9 billion Irathi and a 40-second SOS, and what it meant that the signal had reached him instead of someone else. His communications officer, Voss, said, "Admiral, Fleet Command is asking for clarification on your course plot. They want to know if you are actually proceeding toward the Crawl First Dominion Fleet." He said, "Tell them yes." She said, "They're asking for your tactical justification." He said, "Tell them I'll send it in writing when we arrive." She said, "Admiral, they're saying they need authorization from." He said, "Voss, tell them that 9 billion people sent an SOS and the Thermopylae heard it. Tell them the authorization is the SOS. Send it exactly like that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to her console and sent it exactly like that. The Thermopylae group moved. 1,100 meters of the heaviest warship humanity had ever constructed accelerating to FTL with 3 escort destroyers in formation, and the support and logistics vessels falling into the slipstream. And on every ship in that group, every person who had been asleep was now awake, and every person who was awake knew where they were going and why. Kowalski spent the 17-hour transit doing what he had spent 32 years learning to do, preparing. The tactical assessment HFY delivered at the 1-hour mark was thorough and not encouraging, and was exactly what he needed to read. The Crawl First Dominion Fleet was 200 years of accumulated naval development deployed in the specific way of an organization that had never needed to fundamentally revise its doctrine, because its doctrine had never failed. Heavy capital ships in layered formations, overlapping fields of fire, integrated point defense that made single-ship attack runs a form of expensive suicide. Command structure centralized around a flagship that coordinated the formation's response. A proven system with known vulnerabilities that were theoretical rather than practical, because nobody had ever survived long enough against the First Dominion Fleet to exploit them. He read the assessment twice, then he called HFY to his briefing room. He said, "The flagship coordination system." HFY said, "It's their command structure's core. The First Dominion flagship maintains real-time tactical links to every vessel in the formation. It's faster than distributed command, more responsive, enables coordinated fire solutions across the entire fleet simultaneously." He said, "And if the flagship is degraded?" HFY said, "The formation loses coordination. Individual ship captains revert to standing orders which are aggressive but not adaptive. They become predictable." He said, "How long to revert?" HFY said, "Based on crawl doctrine, approximately 4 minutes to establish secondary command authority in another vessel." He said 4 minutes. HFY said 4 minutes. Kowalski looked at the tactical display on the briefing room table. The schematic of the crawl formation built from the SOS sensor data and 200 years of compact intelligence assessments. He looked at the flagship's position, center rear of the formation, surrounded by its heaviest escorts, protected in the specific way of something that everyone in the formation understood was the most important thing in the formation. He said they protected heavily. HFY said, "Their heaviest escorts, 6 capital ships screening the flagship, overlapping shield coverage, point defense density that makes direct approach effectively impossible for conventional attack vectors." He said conventional. HFY looked at him. He said, "Admiral." He said, "What is the Thermopylae's shield rating at maximum power concentration?" HFY said, slowly, "At full power, Thermopylae's forward shield array is rated to absorb continuous fire from approximately 40 crawl capital ship equivalents for approximately 6 minutes before failure." Kowalski said, 40 ships for 6 minutes. HFY said, "Admiral, you're talking about driving the Thermopylae directly through their formation." He said, "I'm talking about a direct approach to the flagship at maximum speed with full power to forward shields and every weapon we have pointed at the flagship's command systems. 6 capital ships screening it. We go through them." HFY said, "Admiral, the escorts alone." He said, "Will be shooting at us for 6 minutes before our shields fail. In those 6 minutes, what can the Thermopylae do to a crawl flagship at close range?" HFY was quiet for a moment. He was running numbers in his head, and Kowalski could see him running them, and could see the result arriving in his expression. He said, "At close range, with our full primary battery concentrated on the flagship's command structure." He stopped. He said, "We can kill it, Admiral. If we get close enough, we can kill their command system before our shields go." He said, "And the escorts we hit on the way through." HFY said, "At the speed you're describing and the mass of this ship, we're going to do significant damage to anything in our direct path regardless of what we fire at them." Kowalski said, 1,100 meters of Dreadnought at combat speed is a weapon by itself." HFY said, "Yes, it is." Kowalski said, "The escorts." HFY said, "Vandal, Crusader, and Nightfall provide fire support to suppress the perimeter while we make the approach. They hit the formation's flanks, spread their fire, keep as many guns as possible occupied with something other than us." Kowalski said, "And after the flagship goes?" HFY said, 4 minutes of uncoordinated crawl response. Their formation becomes 180 individual decisions instead of one coordinated one. In that window, we withdraw. We get distance. We let them sort out their command situation while we regroup." He said, "And the Arathi Defense Network?" HFY said, "If any of it is still functional when we arrive, it becomes a factor in those 4 minutes. Even degraded, 43 orbital platforms create targeting problems the crawl will have to deal with along with everything else." Kowalski said, "It's a hard plan." HFY said, "It's the only plan that accounts for the numbers, Admiral." He said, "Yes, it is." He looked at the display for another long moment. Then he said, "Brief the escort captains. Full plan, full detail. I want their questions before we arrive, not during." HFY said, "Aye, Admiral." He paused at the door. He said, "Admiral, the Arathi SOS reached us specifically because of our position. No other compact vessel was close enough to respond in time." Kowalski said, "I know." HFY said, 9 billion people. Kowalski said, "I know, Commander, go brief the captains." The briefing with the escort captains happened at the 12-hour mark, 6 hours from arrival, and it was the most direct briefing Kowalski had ever conducted because the situation did not permit anything else. He laid out the plan. He laid out the risks. He did not soften the assessment of what the risks meant because the three captains sitting across from him, Captain Diana Reeves of the Vandal, Captain Thomas Park of the Crusader, Captain Noah Levi of the Nightfall, were experienced officers who had earned the right to unvarnished truth. Said, the Thermopylae takes the direct approach at maximum speed. Your three ships suppress the formation perimeter. You are going to take significant fire. You are faster and more maneuverable than the Thermopylae, which means your survival odds are better than ours, but better is not safe. You need to keep as many crawl guns off the Thermopylae as possible for the 6 minutes it takes us to reach the flagship and kill it. After that, 4 minutes of uncoordinated response. We withdraw under fire. If the situation allows, we regroup. If it doesn't, each ship makes its own best decision. Captain Reeves said, Admiral, what's the Thermopylae's survival assessment if the shields hold for 6 minutes? He said, if the shields hold and we reach the flagship and kill it, our withdrawal odds are acceptable. If the shields fail before we reach the flagship, the outcome is different. She said, different. He said, yes. Captain Park said, we heard the SOS on the Crusader, Admiral. We were already awake when the Thermopylae went to combat speed. My crew knows where we're going. Captain Levi said, same on the Nightfall, no reservations from my end. Captain Reeves said, Vandals ready, Admiral. Kowalski looked at the three of them. He said, good, get back to your ships. Combat stations at T-30 minutes. Questions on the plan come to Okafor, not to me. I'll be busy. They left. Kowalski stood in the empty briefing room for 2 minutes doing nothing except standing in it, which was the thing he did before major engagements, the specific stillness of a person getting ready. Then he went to the bridge. The final hours of transit were quiet in the specific way of ships at combat stations moving toward something unavoidable. Kowalski walked the bridge, not packing, moving with purpose, checking stations, talking to his people, doing what captains did when they wanted their crew to see that the person in charge was calm and focused, not performing calm, actually calm. The calm he had earned over 32 years was real, not theatrical, the calm of someone who had assessed the situation and found it manageable, which it was, barely, if everything went correctly, and which he was going to make go correctly. At T-2 hours, he got a communication from the Arathi Defense Network. Partial signal, fragmented, the transmission degraded by whatever had happened to their orbital infrastructure in the hours since the SOS. The content that came through was a voice, alien in cadence, and translated with the imprecision of a system working on a language it had limited baseline data for, but clear enough in its essentials. The Arathi voice said, Human vessel, we receive your approach signal. We do not understand why you are coming. We sent our distress call expecting no response. Our network is failing. Our losses are, the word came through as numerical data the translation system rendered as significant. We do not understand why you are coming. Kowalski said, we heard your SOS. We're coming because you called and we could answer. Tell your defense network to hold as long as it can. We arrive in 2 hours. A pause that lasted long enough that he thought the signal had been lost. Then, you are one ship. The Crawl First Dominion fleet is. He said, we know what it is. Hold as long as you can. He closed the channel. He did not try to explain further because there was nothing further to explain. They had called. The Thermopylae had answered. The rest was what happened next. At T-30 minutes, combat stations. 4,200 crew members of the UES Thermopylae at every station. Every system at full readiness. Weapons powered and targeted. Shields at maximum rating across all arrays with additional power routed to the forward array in preparation for the approach. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Rosa Diaz called Kowalski from engineering and said, Admiral, I want you to know I've been pushing the power plant for 17 hours. She's giving you everything she has, and then some. He said, will it hold? She said, long enough for what you need it to. He said, that's all I'm asking. She said, aye, Admiral. At T-minus 15 minutes, Tors had the final course solution plotted and confirmed, the specific vector that brought the Thermopylae out of FTL in the position that gave them the best approach geometry to the Crawl flagship's position. Not the safest position, the right one. At T-minus 1 minute, Kowalski sat in his command chair and looked at his bridge and said to all of them, because they deserved to hear it before it started, you know why we're here. You know what's at stake. What I'm going to tell you now is what I want you to remember when it gets hard. We are the Thermopylae. Every person on this ship is the best at what they do. The plan is good. The execution is going to be better. We are going to do this. He said, stand by. Tors said, dropping to real space in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Thermopylae dropped out of FTL, and the Crawl First Dominion fleet was exactly where the data said it would be. 178 ships in layered formation above Irath Secundus, and the Irathi orbital network was still partially functional, 19 platforms still active out of 43, and the fires in orbit were real, and the casualty count was real, and the 9 billion people on the planet below were real. Kowalski said, all ahead full, direct approach to the flagship, weapons free. The Thermopylae moved. 1,100 meters at combat speed was a significant physical fact. The Crawl formation, seeing the Dreadnought drop out of FTL and immediately accelerate toward them on a direct approach vector, required approximately 4 seconds to register what was happening and another 3 seconds to begin coordinating a response. And in those 7 seconds, the Thermopylae covered distance that mattered. Vandal, Crusader, and Nightfall came out of FTL on the formation's flanks simultaneously, 3 destroyers opening fire immediately in the coordinated suppression pattern that Akafor and the escort captains had built during the transit, spreading the Crawl formation's targeting attention across 4 directions at once. Not enough to seriously damage 178 ships. Enough to complicate the response. Enough to buy seconds. Seconds mattered. The Crawl flagship's 6 capital ship escorts were between Kowalski and his target, and the Thermopylae hit the first one at combat speed with full forward shields and every forward weapon battery firing simultaneously. The impact was not a maneuver. It was not elegant. It was 1,100 meters of the heaviest warship humanity had ever built, at full speed, hitting a Crawl capital ship that was trying to get out of the way and not managing it. The Crawl capital ship went sideways. Not destroyed, not immediately, but knocked out of formation and out of the fight for the critical seconds of the approach. And the Thermopylae pushed through the gap it had created, and the second escort was already firing, and the forward shield array was absorbing fire from multiple sources simultaneously. And Diaz's voice came up from engineering with a shield status that Kowalski filed without reacting to. Akafor was firing. He was firing with the same quality of focus he always fired with, which was the complete absence of anything except the targeting problem in front of him. The Crawl flagship's command structure coming closer with every second of the approach. The systems he had identified as critical in 12 hours of analysis, now visible on his targeting display at close range. The forward shields went from 100% to 73% in 90 seconds. 2 of the 6 escorts had repositioned and were firing at angles that the shield concentration had not been built for, and Kowalski said, Webb, angle us. 15 degrees starboard. Bring the shield face to bear. His helmsman, Chief Petty Officer Martin Webb, made the adjustment without lifting his eyes from his console, and the shield geometry shifted, and the fire that had been catching the edge of the array hit the face of it instead, and the percentage stopped dropping quite as fast. 73%. The flagship was 140 kilometers away. Akafor fired 4 shots at the secondary escort directly in their path. 2 hit. The escort lost propulsion and drifted, and the gap it left was not clean, but it was enough, and the Thermopylae went through it, and the flagship was 90 kilometers away, and the shields were at 61%, and every gun the Crawl fleet had that could bear on the Thermopylae was firing. Kowalski said, HFY. HFY said, 60 kilometers, almost there, Admiral. The bridge took a hit. Not catastrophic, a power conduit rupture in the ceiling that showered sparks on 2 consoles and took out 1 secondary display, and someone on Kowalski's left made a sound that he registered and filed for later, and the Thermopylae kept moving. Shields at 44%. 50 kilometers. HFY said, I have targeting solution on the flagship command array, full primary battery, ready on your order. 40 kilometers, shields at 38%. Kowalski said, fire. The Thermopylae's primary battery was, in the fleet's dry specification language, strategically significant. At 40 kilometers, firing at a stationary target with a targeting solution that HFY had been building for 12 hours, with every weapon the ship carried concentrated on a single point, strategically significant was an understatement. The Crawl flagship's command array ceased to exist. It did not explode in any cinematic sense. It simply stopped being a functional piece of military hardware, replaced by a section of hull that was no longer performing any command functions and was not going to perform them again. The flagship itself survived, its hull intact, its crew alive, but its ability to coordinate 178 ships across a real-time tactical network was gone. The formation stuttered. Kowalski had been told 4 minutes. The reality was 3 minutes and 40 seconds before the Crawl identified their secondary command vessel and began the transfer process. And in those 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the formation's response to the Thermopylae's withdrawal was not coordinated. Individual ship captains fell back on standing orders. Standing orders were aggressive and effective, but they were not adaptive, and they were not unified, and they created targeting conflicts and communication gaps that a coordinated formation would not have had. The Thermopylae turned and withdrew at maximum speed. The escorts turned with it. Vandal had taken heavy damage, one of her drive systems offline, and she was slower than her rated speed, and Crusader fell back to cover her, which was not in the original plan but was exactly what Park would do because it was what you did when a ship next to you was hurt and you had anything left to give. The Arathi orbital platforms, 19 of them still active, opened fire on the Crawl formation during those 3 minutes and 40 seconds. They were firing at a fleet that outmassed them by a factor that made the engagement mathematically absurd. They fired anyway. 19 platforms adding their weapons to the confusion of a formation trying to re-establish coordination, while simultaneously dealing with a Dreadnought punching through its center, and 3 destroyers on its flanks, and its own capital ships firing without unified targeting solutions. The Crawl fleet did not break. Kowalski had not expected it to break. What it did was hesitate, and hesitation was enough. The 4 ships of the Thermopylae group cleared the engagement zone before coordinated Crawl fire could be re-established, and by the time the formation had a secondary command structure functional and a coherent pursuit solution plotted, the Thermopylae was at a range where pursuit without FTL was meaningless. The Crawl did not pursue with FTL. Kowalski thought about that later in the after-action, turning it over and examining it. A fleet of 178 ships, their command destroyed and their formation disrupted, but still functionally intact, choosing not to pursue 4 human vessels into FTL. He thought about the calculation their new commander had run in those first minutes of reorganized authority. He thought about what answer that calculation had produced. He thought the answer had been, something that does what just happened is not something we chase. The damage to the Thermopylae was real and extensive, and the repair list was long, and the casualty count was 26 wounded and 3 dead. 3 members of his crew who had come aboard this ship and done their jobs and died doing them. And Kowalski carried their names with him from the moment Akafor reported it, and would carry them for the rest of his life in the way he carried all of them. He sat in the after-action briefing and heard the full damage assessment and the tactical reconstruction and the analysis of the Crawl fleet's behavior, and said very little. He let Akafor and the analysis team do their jobs. He listened and asked the questions that needed asking and made the command decisions about the repair priority and the reporting sequence, and when to attempt recontact with the Arathi. The Arathi recontact attempt was answered within 20 minutes. The signal came in clearly this time, the transmission not degraded by active combat disrupting their network. And the voice on the other end was not the same voice as the partial transmission from the approach, was someone more senior, was someone who had clearly been waiting. The Arathi representative said, "Thermopylae, you are alive." Kowalski said, "We're alive. How are your people?" A pause. Then, "We are assessing. The bombardment stopped when your fleet engaged. The platforms you saved, the 19 that remained, they are still functional. Our surface casualties are." Another pause, and the word that came through the translation was a Arathi word that the system rendered with a confidence flag, approximating to enormous. "We are still counting." He said, "I'm sorry we didn't get there sooner." The Arathi representative said, "You came at all. We sent the SOS without expectation. We sent it because it was the only remaining action available to us. We did not," the translation struggled for a moment, "we did not believe Deathworlders would respond." Kowalski said, "Deathworlders." A pause. Then, "It is what many species call humans. The world you come from is classified in compact biological surveys as a death world. Extreme gravity, extreme climate variation, extreme predator density. Species from death worlds are considered formidable in ways that are sometimes alarming." Kowalski said, "We didn't know that." The Arathi said, "You drove one ship through the center of the Crawl First Dominion fleet." He said, "We had to get to the flagship." The Arathi said, "No other species in the compact would have considered that approach viable." Kowalski thought about that for a moment. He said, "We didn't consider it comfortable. We considered it necessary." The Arathi said, "Yes. That is the translation flagged uncertainty. That is the distinction. Comfortable versus necessary. Humans appear to process these categories differently than other species." He said, "Our planet probably had something to do with that." The Arathi was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "The Crawl have withdrawn to their staging area. Our analysis suggests they are regrouping. They will return." Kowalski said, "We know. That's why I'm already composing the signal to Fleet Command. The Compact needs to know what happened here. The Crawl used the First Dominion fleet against a civilian trading collective with no military capacity. That's a change in Crawl doctrine. That concerns everyone, not just the Arathi." He said, "You're not alone in this. That's what I need you to understand. You sent the SOS because you had no other option. From now on, you have more options. Not because of what we did today, but because of what today proves. The signal works. Someone answers." The Arathi said, "The Thermopylae answered." He said, "This time. Next time it might be someone else. The point is that next time there will be someone. The Compact is bigger than any one fleet, and the Crawl just demonstrated to every member of it what their intentions are. That changes the politics. That changes the resources available to you." He said, "Don't let it take more attacks to prove the point. Contact the Compact Council immediately. Use the sensor data from today's engagement. Show them what the Crawl did and show them what happened when someone responded. Make the case for a permanent defense arrangement." The Arathi said, "You are advising us on compact diplomacy." Kowalski said, "I'm advising you on how to make sure this never happens again. The tactics are different, but the logic is the same. You found out that calling for help works. Call louder." On the bridge behind him, His crew was doing what crews did after combat: repairing, restoring, accounting for damage and casualties, and the dozen follow-on tasks that a major engagement created. 4,197 people still alive and doing their jobs. 3 names he was going to carry. On Irath Secundus below, 9 billion people who had been under bombardment 3 hours ago were not under bombardment now. The fires were still burning in some places. The damage was real. The counting that the Irathi representative had mentioned was still happening, and the number it would eventually reach would be the number it would reach, and there was nothing to be done about that now except make sure it did not keep climbing. The crawl had withdrawn. The Thermopylae was damaged and her crew was exhausted, and her repair list was going to keep the fleet's dockyard busy for 3 months. And Kowalski sat in his command chair and began composing the signal to Fleet Command, the after-action report that was going to change the Compact's assessment of crawl intentions and the resource allocation for this sector, and probably a dozen other things that would only become apparent in the weeks and months of follow-on decisions that major engagements created. He wrote clearly and specifically, the way he always wrote, without drama and without omission. He described the SOS and the decision to respond, and the transit and the tactical plan and the engagement and the outcome, and the 3 names he was going to carry, and the 19 Irathi platforms still active and the crawl withdrawal. He wrote, the crawl First Dominion fleet was deployed against a civilian population. The response was 1 Dreadnought and 3 destroyers. The outcome was the preservation of an inhabited world and the withdrawal of the attacking force. This outcome was not guaranteed. It was achieved through the willingness of this crew to execute a plan that the numbers did not favor, because the numbers on the other side of the ledger were 9 billion people. He wrote, the SOS system works. The Irathi sent their distress call without expectation of response. The response came. This should be the standard, not the exception. Every species in this compact should understand that when they send the signal, someone answers. He wrote, the Thermopylae answered today. Tomorrow it may be someone else. The point is that tomorrow there is someone. He submitted the report. Then he stood up from his command chair and walked to the viewport and looked at the planet below, at Irath Secundus turning in its star's light, green-gray and scarred in places, but there, present, occupied by 9 billion lives that had sent 40 seconds of desperation into the dark, and received in answer, the heaviest warship humanity had ever built, arriving at combat speed with its weapons hot, and its crew ready and its captain completely certain of only one thing: that the SOS had reached the right ship. He stood at the viewport for a long time. Below him, the planet turned. Behind him, his crew worked. Around him, the Thermopylae held its position above a world it had crossed 19 light towers to protect, damaged and operational, and exactly where it was supposed to be. He thought about the Irathi representative's words. You drove 1 ship through the center of the crawl First Dominion fleet. He had not thought of it that way while he was doing it. He had thought of it as, the flagship is there, we have to get to the flagship, this is how we get there. The framing the Irathi used suggested something different, something that required stepping back to the distance other species occupied relative to what humans did and how they decided to do it. Maybe that was the death world thing. Maybe growing up on a planet that was trying to kill you in 100 different ways at once genuinely changed how you process the category of necessary. Maybe there was something in the specific human calculation of acceptable risk that looked, from the outside, like something other than calculation. He thought, or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's that someone was in trouble, and we could do something, and so we did. He thought that was probably the whole of it. He thought that was probably enough. The Thermopylae held position above Irath Secundus, and the stars were where they had always been. And somewhere in the dark, the crawl First Dominion fleet was regrouping and making its own calculations, and those calculations would lead somewhere, and wherever they led the compact would have to be ready. But not tonight. Tonight the planet was there, and the crew was alive, and the 3 names were being logged in the official record with the language the fleet used for people who had died doing what the fleet asked them to do. Language that was true and inadequate in the specific way all such language was. And Kowalski would find better words for them later, in the private record he kept, in the place where he tried to do justice to the gap between the official accounting and the actual weight of what was owed. Tonight was for that. Tomorrow was for everything else.